Hey everyone, welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're going on a really fascinating journey. We're going to trace this incredible thread that connects massive, global macroeconomic forces all the way down to our hyperlocal microeconomics. Honestly, if you want to understand the true economic catalysts of 2025 and 2026, you absolutely have to see how the big picture completely reshapes the small picture.
Okay, let's dive into this. It kind of sounds like the setup to a strange riddle, right? What on earth is the link between United States presidential politics, the vast, dense forests of Canada, and the bustling real estate market in a Montreal suburb? Well, they aren't separate worlds at all. They're actually deeply connected by a chain reaction of economic decisions that ultimately impact everything from national industries right down to our daily commutes and home values.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to quickly cover U.S. presidential powers, the impact of customs tariffs, the softwood lumber dispute, public versus private forests, the REM revolution, and finally, real estate and lifestyle.
Section 1. U.S. Presidential Powers, the Executive Branch. To really understand these global trade shifts, we first have to look at the structural changes happening within the U.S. government. A recent analysis from the Quebec Municipal Appraisers Association poses a direct, fascinating question. Why is Donald Trump considered by many analysts to be the most powerful president in modern history? Understanding this underlying structural power is absolutely key to understanding the economic catalysts that follow.
Well, to answer that, we have to look at the traditional balance of power. The U.S. system relies on three distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. However, the source material notes a really significant structural shift toward the executive branch. We're currently seeing a high volume of executive decrees that literally bypass the traditional legislative process, involving those 100 senators and 435 representatives in Congress. The executive branch has directly withheld specific health and welfare funding, and they've placed non-elected officials in charge of highly sensitive finance and budget departments. Plus, a recent Supreme Court ruling regarding presidential immunity has provided a remarkably broad legal shield for these exact executive actions. It's this centralization of power that is the engine driving sweeping new trade policies.
Section 2. Impact of customs tariffs, 25% and beyond.
So that centralized executive authority directly fuels our next macro layer, tariffs, and this brilliantly illustrates how they actually work in the real world, beyond just punishing imports. Imagine you've got two companies selling comparable tires for $100. Enterprise A imports them from Canada. Because of a new 25% tariff, they have to pay an extra $25 at the border, which forces them to raise their retail price to $125 just to break even. Now look at Enterprise B, a U.S. domestic manufacturer. They pay no tariffs, but instead of keeping their price at $100, they realize they can just raise it to $115. They instantly increase their profit margins while still comfortably beating Enterprise A's price. Tariffs inherently cause inflation across the board because domestic companies will raise prices simply because that protective umbrella allows them to.
And when you factor in the currency exchange, the math gets even tougher for the consumer. You might think, hey, if the Canadian dollar drops 10% in value, it kind of softens the blow of a 25% U.S. tariff on our exports. But actually, look at this formula. For Canadians buying bananas or really any imported goods, a 10% drop in currency combined with a 25% tariff creates a compounding effect. They're effectively facing a 35% price increase. Ouch. So while a lower dollar might theoretically help exporters, it heavily penalizes our domestic purchasing power and foreign investment returns.
Section 3. Softwood lumber dispute, a decades-long battle.
So bridging these ideas, you have the overarching geopolitical relationship, like the international border between the U.S. and Canada. But then you have the reality on the ground, a logging truck cutting through a massive forest property. These large forest properties are essentially huge, living real estate investments. When international tariff wars break out at the border, it's these physical, localized landscapes and the regional economies that depend on them that take the immediate financial hit.
But this is definitely not a new fight. It's a deeply structural one. Tracing the dispute all the way back to 1982 with Lumber 1, initial attempts at duties were actually blocked. By 1986's Lumber 2, we saw a 15% export tax negotiated. Fast forward through the compensatory and anti-dumping duties of the early 2000s, and we arrive at Lumber 5 in 2024. Through a combination of ongoing disputes and sweeping executive decrees, the total tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber recently escalated to a staggering 39.54%.
Section 4. Public versus private forests, the core argument. So why does this specific industry get targeted time and time again? Why is there constant friction? Now, what's really interesting here is how the United States actually manages its massive woodland resources. Look at the data. 63% of U.S. forests are privately owned. In fact, these private lands provide nearly 89% of all the wood harvested in the country. To the American eye, forestry is a predominantly private, free market enterprise driven by private landowners.
Contrast that immediately with Canadian forest tenure. An overwhelming 94% of Canadian forests are public lands, mostly provincial, with only 6% being privately owned. This massive structural difference in land ownership is the absolute crux of the decades-long argument. American producers look at this 94% public ownership and argue that Canadian wood is fundamentally and unfairly subsidized by the government, and that leads to the constant accusations of dumping and the relentless cycle of tariffs we just looked at.
Section 5. The REM Revolution. Local Disruptors.
Okay, we've gone from the White House down to Canadian lumber mills. Now let's zoom all the way into a hyper-local level. Pierrefonds Roxborough in Montreal's West Island. 35 minutes. It's a simple number, but if you've ever sat in Montreal traffic, you know that is basically a miracle. The arrival of the Anse Alarme branch of the new light rail network, the REM, means residents can now commute directly from this quiet, green suburb straight into downtown Montreal in just about 35 minutes.
And this infrastructure isn't just about trains, guys. It's a massive economic catalyst built on lifestyle. It means drastically less time sitting in traffic and total independence from those unpredictable, stressful commuting patterns. It offers incredible flexibility for professionals and families who want the space and comfort of the suburbs without feeling totally disconnected from the city's economic center. In 2026, this kind of mobility is no longer just a nice-to-have bonus. It's the ultimate deciding factor driving unprecedented local real estate demand.
Section 6. Real Estate and Lifestyle, the 2026 Landscape. Let's move to and see how this builds real, tangible value. Because how does a local train line compete with inflation and international trade wars? Well, it competes by creating rock-solid local value. $639,000. According to our sources, that is the striking median price of a single-family home in Greater Montreal as of February 2026.
And that number represents a robust 6.5% year-over-year increase. I mean, think about that for a second. Despite everything we discussed at the start of this explainer, the very real threat of 25% tariffs, a drop in currency, and these massive historical trade disputes, the local market is absolutely thriving. So, the crucial point is this. While global macroeconomics can create severe headwinds and inflation, strategic local investments, like the REM, that fundamentally improve daily quality of life, continue to drive incredible localized economic surges.
We've traced the economic forces of 2025 and 2026 all the way from the Oval Office, through the vast Canadian public forests, right up to the front door of a suburban Montreal home. It really shows us that economics is this dynamic, interconnected ecosystem of action and reaction. Which brings us to a final thought for you today. As massive macro policies reshape national industries all around the globe, how will your own local microeconomy adapt and thrive? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped connect the dots for you, and I will catch you on the next one.